Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's lecture hosted by the University of Bath Institute for Policy Research and Cardiff University Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm Professor of Public Policy and Director of the IPR at the University of Bath. And I'm delighted this evening to welcome you to this online lecture by Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh. Lorraine is Director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations and an environmental psychologist now based at the University of Bath. It's great to have you with us at the university, Lorraine. And she specialises in perceptions and behaviour in relation to climate change, energy and transport. And her research projects are focused on studies of energy efficiency behaviours, waste reduction, carrier bag reuse, perceptions of smart technologies, electric vehicles, and increasingly responses to climate change. And she's worked as a lead author for panels advising the IPCC, regularly advises government and other organisations on low carbon behaviour change and climate change communications. And she was recently named in the Reuters list of the world's top climate scientists. So it's a real treat to have her lecturing us this evening. She's going to talk tonight about the importance of engaging the public in the changes required to address climate change, particularly focusing on changing consumers' food choices and food systems change. And she'll present insights on public views on low carbon sustainable food policies from the Climate Assembly in the UK, the first climate assembly that was held across the UK on climate change, and presenting findings from research into how changing diets can promote low carbon sustainable food choices. So it's great to have Lorraine with us. Before we start the lecture, I just have to do a little bit of housekeeping, which is to say that your cameras and microphones will remain switched off. If you've got a question, and there'll be an opportunity for debate after Lorraine's lecture, post them in the Q&A, and then what I'll do is I'll pull together different questions and we'll have a debate after the lecture. The session is being recorded, so filming and photography is being taking place, and we will make the lecture available online as a podcast and a video at a later date, so you can catch up with it again then. Okay, well, that's probably enough from me, and it's my great pleasure then to pass now over to Lorraine. Lorraine.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here this evening. And I will be presenting on engaging the public in changing diets and wider food systems to tackle climate change. The background of this, of course, is that climate change poses very significant risks to society and to ecosystems. And we're seeing growing impacts from climate change around the world, from Australian bushfires a year or so ago to impacts closer to home, like flooding in the West Country, for example. And we're likely to see more and more of these sorts of impacts and risks in the future. And so from analysis by, for example, the IPCC, we know that we need to significantly transform societies in order to cut our emissions to tackle climate change. So we need to be reaching our net zero emissions, so zero emissions by the middle of the century at the very latest, and ideally sooner. And actually in the UK, we have some of the toughest legislation to tackle climate change. And just recently, the UK government announced it was speeding up its target to cut carbon emissions. And so we're now aiming for a 78% cut in emissions by 2035. So this implies really significant, profound, and rapid change to all areas of our lives and to society as a whole, from the way we travel to how we use energy, how we consume, and, as I'll be talking about this evening, our diets. And really what I want to emphasize is the role that people play in driving this transformation of society to tackle climate change. And when I'm talking about people, I'm not just talking about us as consumers, although that is an important role we play. We do buy things that have different levels of impact on the climate, but we're also citizens. We can vote for green policies and we can support climate action in terms of the policy context. But we're also maybe members of families and communities. We may be employees or employers. So we can exert influence in different ways across a range of different contexts. Both directly to reduce our emissions, but also indirectly, maybe shaping kind of organizations or the people that we come into contact with, we can influence as well. But some analysis by the UK Committee on Climate Change very recently estimated that about 60% of the measures needed to get to net zero emissions will require at least some degree of behaviour change. And actually, I think that's using a rather narrow definition of behaviour change, because actually even the remaining 40%, which is primarily technological change, will require some degree of human decision making about which technologies we do and do not use. So the role of people is key, and that's really what I want to focus on this evening. And I'm also focusing particularly on diet. And the reason is because at least a quarter of our emissions, our global climate change emissions, come from food. And that's a similar sort of percentage in the UK specifically. So about a quarter of our emissions come from our food. And as you can see on the left here, more than half of the food emissions come from animal products specifically. So that's a big chunk of where our emissions come from. And half of all the farmed animal emissions are coming from beef and lamb specifically. So it's red meat, but also to some extent dairy are some of the things that are really causing the biggest impact in terms of our diets. So it's led some analysis to suggest that going vegan could be the single best thing we could do to cut our carbon footprint. And while we certainly don't all need to go vegan, we or in fact cut down on food from animals completely, it is certainly the case that we do need to reduce animal products from our diet by at least 20% in the next sort of 10 years, and probably more in later years, according to the UK government's climate advisors. And it's worth also noting that apart from needing to change our diet for climate change reasons, we do also need to think about dietary change for other reasons, particularly health. So we obviously know for quite a long time that, particularly in Western countries, but in many other countries as well, actually our diets are contributing very significantly to major health risks like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, cancers, and so on. And it's important to note that actually the sorts of changes that we need to tackle those sorts of significant health problems linked to our diets and obesity, for example, those sorts of changes would actually help tackle climate change as well. So healthy diets are low carbon diets. So you can see here, I mentioned already that beef and lamb, for example, red meat, tends to be where most of our emissions come from food. Also some dairy products are quite high too. If we eat less red meat, less dairy, but other sorts of cut down on other unhealthy foods like soft drinks and so on, even just conforming to WHO dietary guidelines to be healthy, that would significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But if we actually cut down on a bit more on red meat and dairy, we would do even better. Okay, so if we accept that we do need to change our diets to at least some extent to tackle climate change, as well as maybe health reasons as well, how do we go about doing that? Well, there has been recent controversy over the possibility of having meat taxes in this country. So the Sun had this headline a couple of months ago, "Hands off our sausages," at the suggestion that there might be a meat tax being proposed by MPs to tackle climate change. They then lobbied Number 10 and were happy to report that as a result of this, meat prices will not be rising. So we will not have a sausage tax, thanks to the Sun. But to what extent does this concern about meat taxes actually reflect what the public would and would not support? Well, we've done some surveys recently trying to explore this. And this gives you some examples of the sorts of results from this. This was a UK-wide survey towards the end of 2020. And we asked about whether, broadly speaking, there was support or opposition for these various diet-related policies. So we can see that vegetarian and vegan options being mandatory in restaurants received, more support than opposition. There was broad support, but also a decent amount of opposition to research on looking into alternative meat sources, so things like lab-grown meat, for example. There was very strong support for food labelling to show carbon emissions, but actually, and this is perhaps the Sun got it right, there wasn't support at all, or there wasn't very much support, I should say, for increasing the price of meat products. So economic measures to discourage meat consumption, not very popular. And what's interesting as well is that actually, of all the things that cause climate change, understanding about the role of diet is one of the lowest amongst the public. So while most people do understand that how we travel, for example, and how we heat and light our homes contributes to climate change, actually there isn't so much awareness that eating less red meat would help contribute to reducing our carbon footprint. So that there is something to be said about maybe the extent to which the public don't necessarily know that we need to change our diets, and that might contribute to some of the support or opposition to certain policies as well. But it's also going beyond this sort of public opinion polling is really important to really get a sense of what sorts of measures people would support and why. And that's because we know from previous examples that actually we can't really impose solutions on people. We need to engage the public in constructing those solutions to complex issues like climate change. So we would end up with sort of fuel duty protest or gilets jaunes if we were to try to implement, if policymakers would try to implement something like a meat tax, for example, if there was not public support for that. And we know, in fact, that actually perceptions of the fairness of policies is often more important to the public than the perception of the effectiveness of those policies. So it does matter capturing public views, and particularly views about whether those policies are fair. And we also know actually that listening to the public, engaging with people, and participatory approaches to policymaker can actually improve policy outcomes, because the more that you engage with a more diverse range of people and people that will be affected by particular policies, the more likely you are to end up with workable policies. So it is important to listen to the public and what they think. Now, one way we can do this, as Nick mentioned, is through citizens' assemblies. Citizens' assemblies are ways in which we can get a deeper understanding of what the public think about different policies on, it's usually applied to sort of controversial topics or complex topics where there might be implications for lifestyles, for example. So we really need to understand what the public think. And it provides a detailed understanding, and it also it gives an opportunity for those participants in citizens' assemblies to actually learn more about these options and the pros and cons of these things, rather than, if you just do a public opinion poll, you don't necessarily know if people really understand all the details of those policies that are being talked about. So this Climate Assembly UK was actually the first UK-wide citizens' assembly on climate change. There have been one or two others in other countries. There have been several at more local levels in the UK and elsewhere too. And in this case, it was commissioned by Parliament, by 6 select committees, to look at how the UK should reach its legally binding target of net zero emissions by 2050. And so it provides a lot of insight into what the public will and won't support and why. And it involved over 100 members of the UK public who were a representative sample of the population in terms of age, gender, income, regions, and levels of concern about climate change. So it was people who were very concerned about climate change through to people that were very disengaged and even skeptical about it. So really a microcosm of the UK, actually. And this group met over 6 weekends in 2020 to learn about climate change and various different policy options for how we could reach our climate change targets. And they deliberated over the evidence, discussed it, and made recommendations. I was involved particularly on the food and food systems and diet side of things. And so this was just one of many topics that were discussed at the assembly. And in relation to this food and land use topic, we presented assembly members with 3 possible scenarios really for food and land use that could help us get to net zero emissions. And these 3 scenarios or futures were, first of all, the smarter farming, we called it. And this was where farming becomes more efficient and it uses land potentially to store carbon. But crucially, all of the changes happening on the farming side. So there are new kind of efficient farming technologies and techniques, but consumers are not changing. Okay, so there's no reduction in consumers' choices or reduction in meat or dairy at all. The second future we called eating differently, and this was where farmers, retailers and consumers take steps to reduce food waste and choose lower carbon foods. And so this includes people eating about 20% less red meat and dairy compared to today. And it's so, but there was change on all sides. So the farmers were also doing things differently and retailers also. The final scenario we called local food and rewilding. This was the most sort of radical scenario, if you like, because it involved fundamental change in food systems and landscapes towards more local food production and also more space for biodiversity. So it was turning over areas that isn't currently used for agriculture to sort of to biodiversity, to rewilding certain areas of the UK. And significantly, it included people eating at least 40% less red meat and dairy. So a more significant change in diets. Now, what you see on the right-hand side here is the results of the ranking that we asked people to do. So we asked people to basically vote on which of these 3 futures they preferred. And what you can see from the top one is this is the percentage of first choice votes. Okay, so 26%, their first choice was the smarter farming one, the one in which consumers don't change. The next most popular was eating differently, and then the most popular here was the local food and rewilding one. Slightly different results if you basically include first, second, and third choice votes, and you weight them accordingly. So you give more weight to the first choice and then less to the second, and so on. And what you see here is not quite the same, but the consistent aspect here is that smarter farming is again the least popular, whereas the eating differently and local food more popular, and the eating differently slightly ahead in this case. So what this showed was that actually there was more support for a future in which consumers did change their diet than a one in which they did not. And that was maybe surprising in some ways, but then actually if we looked at why that was, this starts to make sense, because the discussions around these futures really showed that there was strong support for localizing food production and local produce, and that was a very strong feature of that final scenario. And there was also support for changing diets, partly because people could see that there were strong health reasons for doing that, as well as climate reasons. And there was strong support for ensuring that we use the land for multiple things, and managed diversity, as we call it, so that it could help with flood alleviation, that we would use it also as a space to have a flourishing biodiversity, but it would also support food production as well, so that we tried to achieve multiple ecosystem services through the land that we were using. But there were concerns around some aspects of the futures, and so where there was where genetic modification and lab-grown meat were featured, and they featured very heavily, particularly in the first future, the one where there was more sort of technological focus and all the change was really happening on the farming side. There were concerns about those technologies and that maybe they were untested or there might be unintended side effects. So there were some anxieties around those new technologies. There were also concerns about animal welfare, and that was a consistent concern that came out. Again, in the first scenario, there was more emphasis on intensification as a way in which we could continue to produce the amount of food that we need without consumers having to change their behaviour. So that was how that was achieved. But there were concerns that that was done to the detriment potentially of animal welfare. And throughout all of the futures, there was a concern that whatever we do, we need to be considering the impact on lower income families and households, and making sure that that we don't leave those groups behind, or that they're not disadvantaged. As part of the various policies that we also discussed with Assembly members, we included some which focused particularly on the retail and consumer side of things. We also had some that looked at what farmers were doing. But this chart shows the results from the vote that focused particularly on the consumer and retail side. And what you can see is that there was the strongest support for labelling and information. So the darker green is the strongly agree, light green is agree. There were reasonable levels of support for government contracts for low carbon food. So this is sort of public procurement. So public sector buying more low carbon food to help reduce prices and increase availability. Taxes and incentives for reducing food waste, quite strong support. Slightly less when it comes to those measures being applied to low carbon foods, for example, plant-based foods. And then least support where we were discussing potentially targeted bans or restrictions on certain types of high carbon food. So there were more mixed views about that one. Now, what's also important to point out at this point is that while we were interested in what additional measures the government and others could put in place, what measures businesses also could implement to change diets and change food systems as part of that, actually diets have been changing already in recent years. So we know that while the majority of people do eat some meat in the UK, more and more people are calling themselves flexitarians or pescatarians or vegetarians, etc. So there's an increase in trying to reduce the amount of meat that we eat, and particularly in certain types of meat. So actually, while the amount of white meat, chicken and turkey, has gone down very slightly, we see more decreases in some of the sort of more processed meat and in red meats particularly. So we're already seeing, and we have been for about a decade at least, a decrease in the amount of meat that we're eating in this country. And interestingly, this trend has actually accelerated in the last year or so. So COVID, of course, we've changed our lifestyles very dramatically over the last year. But one of the interesting areas has been that people have experimented more with vegetarian and vegan foods during lockdown, and that we've seen an increase in sales of these sorts of plant-based foods. And producers are really seeing this as part of not just a temporary trend, but actually a longer term shift away from meat towards more plant-based diets. And so they are investing very heavily in these sorts of products. So there's going to be Unilever, for example, have said they are, I think, increasing their investment in these sorts of products by 5-fold over the next few years. And we see that these shifts in diet are definitely sort of accelerating over the last year or so, and it's particularly amongst certain groups actually. So women, for example, and young people are particularly likely to not want to eat meat, and particularly red meat. So these trends are accelerating, and consistent with that, or at least in parallel with that, we see that public concern about climate change has not been dented by COVID, and in some ways it's actually been a concern about the issue has slightly increased. So this figure on the left shows that the polling that we did within 2020 showed actually a slight increase in the percentages in the UK saying that addressing climate change requires either an extremely high level of urgency or a high level of urgency compared to the previous year, which was already quite high levels of expressed concern. And we see as well, interestingly, a rise in support for policies to tackle climate change. For example, reducing the amount of meat in our diet and limiting flying. And just to give you a bit more of a flavour, this is our latest survey. So from November, the end of November 2020, we asked about support for measures to tackle climate change, and you can see that things like buying energy efficient products and appliances, there's extremely high levels of support. Over 90% say we should probably or definitely do that to tackle climate change. Changing travel habits, also support for that, and even limiting flying, which is something we hadn't seen very strong support for previously, but that there's growing support for that. But of relevance to what we're talking about here, we see that over 70% say that we should be reducing the amount of meat products in our diets to tackle climate change. And rather fewer, but still over half, say we should reduce the amount of dairy products in our diets. So what I've shown so far is a sort of fairly consistent picture, in the sense that people are already starting to eat less meat and are increasingly supporting measures to tackle climate change by changing diets and food systems, and including measures to change our diets. But how do we actually go about doing that? Because it's one thing to say that we support changing diets, but we know there's often a gap between what people say they would do and what they actually do. Very broadly, there are two sort of main categories of behaviour change intervention. There's the sort of what we call the downstream measures, where we're targeting people's decision making directly, usually by giving them information of some kind. And so one example, which comes from a menu from a National Trust cafe in the Lake District, where as a pilot, they put some carbon dioxide information against the different menu options, so that you can see directly how much something like a lamb stew produces in terms of carbon dioxide emissions compared to the chips. So chips would be the option there, if you care about climate change, I guess. And for some people who are very interested in climate change and maybe notice that information, that might shape their behaviour. But we know that generally those sorts of downstream measures probably only work to a very limited extent. They tend not to be very effective, at least by themselves. And so we do need what we call upstream measures. We need to actually change the context in which people make decisions. So we need to change the availability of plant-based foods in canteens, for example. We need to make them more visible. We need to reduce the number of meat options available for people. We maybe need to change the prices to make lower carbon foods cheaper and higher carbon foods more expensive, to incentivize people to make environmentally beneficial choices, and so on. So there are a whole range of kind of measures that sit within this category. But also we need to think about getting the timing right. And this is one thing that we don't always remember when we think about behaviour change interventions, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But just thinking about these kind of downstream informational approaches, I want to give you one example of a very recent study we did, where we tried to vary the type of information we gave people about meat consumption to try and encourage them to eat less red and processed meat. And we had, 4 different groups in our study. We had a control group who didn't see any information about meat at all. We had what we call the health group, and that was a group of people who saw regular messages about the health benefits of eating less red and processed meat. For example, reduction in developing liver disease or various cancers. The environment group saw messages which talked about the environmental benefits of eating less red and processed meat. So, for example, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the combined group, as you might guess, saw a mixture of health and environmental benefits in their messages. And so this is an example of the sort of thing that they got. And this was through a sort of social media chatbot message that they got quite regularly over a 2-week period. And at the end of the 2 weeks, what we found was that actually across all 3 of those groups that saw messages about the benefits of eating less red and processed meat, we saw a significant reduction in meat consumption. And actually that was sustained over for another, when we followed up a month later. And it was even the combined group, the combined message group seemed to be the one where there was slightly the lowest meat consumption. So maybe there was an additional effect of combining the messages. But nevertheless, it does suggest that giving people information actually can, in certain cases, change people's behaviour. But as I've mentioned, it's actually usually more effective to change the context in which we're acting. So to give you an example, Cambridge University banned red meat altogether on its campus in its canteens, and that led to a 33% reduction in carbon emissions from per kilogram of food purchased. But we don't necessarily have to ban red meat or meat altogether. Studies in which they doubled the proportion of vegetarian meals on offer, but still retained meat choices, showed that vegetarian food sales increased by between 41% and 79%. So actually a very significant shift without even removing choice altogether. So we know changing the availability of meat increases the likelihood that people choose meat-free options. But actually there isn't very much evidence on what economic measures like the meat tax that I've mentioned, or regulatory measures as well might do. So we still need to know more about what sort of effect different measures might have. But the final thing I wanted to mention is to return to this point about timing, because actually it does matter when you implement measures to change behaviour, because a big barrier to changing behaviour is our habits. We often just are on autopilot and do the same thing that we have done previously in a particular situation. So travel habits, for example, you know, when you get up in the morning and you think about going to the shop or to work when we used to commute, you will tend to just take the same mode of transport that you have always taken. And you don't really deliberate over different options and weigh up pros and cons. And so that means it's quite difficult to change behaviour. And similarly, in a supermarket situation where you might be choosing, you know, your different types of food, you will often choose the same thing that you have chosen previously and the same brands and so on. So it is difficult to change people's behaviour when it's become habitual. But there are times when habits become weaker or maybe completely disrupted. And at those moments, those are opportunities when we can most effectively change people's behaviour. So to give you an example, we know from a German study from some years ago, they gave some bus information to a sample of residents in a city, and along with a one-day bus pass to try the bus for free. And they gave that to a group of people who had not recently moved house. And they gave the same intervention to a group who had in the last 6 weeks moved home. And what they found was that this intervention, which was a pretty low cost intervention really, was very effective amongst those people who had moved house. So it over doubled the proportion of bus use being undertaken there from 18% to 47%. Whereas there was a non-significant increase. So there was a very slight increase, but it's not statistically significant amongst people who had not moved house. So it basically didn't really work for people who had strong travel habits already. So we can learn from this, but also a growing number of studies actually, that the timing is really important for getting interventions to work. So I think it's an open question about whether we can do this for dietary change. And I think this is something that we want to increasingly test out in our research. So just to sum up then, we need to change diets for climate reasons, but also health reasons. Meat consumption is already starting to reduce in this country for a variety of reasons. Part of it is to do with animal welfare, concerns about health, but also sustainability and climate. And there is support from the UK public via opinion polls, but also climate assemblies to change diets and food systems more widely to help tackle climate change, but under certain conditions. So if they are seen to achieve broader benefits, economic, environmental, social benefits, and if they are seen to be fair as well. Policies that are most supported tend to involve improved information, but also public procurement and increasing the variety and availability of plant-based foods, whereas there is less support for economic and regulatory measures. But we know that information alone tends not to be very effective to change behaviour, so we do need to do more to reduce the availability of meat and increase the availability of plant-based alternatives. And generally, we know it's best to combine interventions, actually. So you do all of these sorts of things together. And as I've said, get the timing right. And we know that COVID-19 has been an accelerator of change. More and more people are trying out vegetarian and vegan diets. They're also reducing their food waste, by the way. And so what can we do to lock in these emerging low carbon habits so that they endure beyond COVID? And I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Lorraine. Thanks for a fantastic lecture. We've got quite a number of questions. I'm just going to pull a few more new ones up as I'm speaking. And one of the first sort of set of questions I think, Lorraine, is around this issue of, you mentioned in your lecture that we have limited evidence on taxation and regulatory changes that we might make in respect of meat and dairy consumption in particular. And of course, you know, that usually the first tool that the economist goes into in the toolbox is to stick the price up. You know, demand will fall if the price rises. And I wonder, one of our questions related to the kind of experience of the sugar tax. I mean, if we don't have direct evidence of taxing meat and dairy products, do we have experience from other areas where we've tried to use taxation to change behaviour that we might bring to bear on this question?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think you're right. So what we can do is we can infer probably how something like a sausage tax might work. And I think it's worth saying as well that we can learn a lot about why some of those measures might not be supported by the public, because there are concerns about equity, for example, distributional effects. So, you know, how is it fair that the rich can continue to eat lots of sausages and the poor can't? So we need to kind of bear that in mind, I think, when we're kind of designing these measures. And I think you're right that the sugar tax is a great example of where we can draw some good lessons. That was a measure applied to on the production side, to try and change producers' behaviour to reduce sugar in products, and by doing that, it then meant that consumers, you know, were not sort of directly affected, but in effect ended up consuming less sugar in the products that they were buying. So I think if you have those sorts of measures that are targeted more on the producer side, to encourage, well, farmers and retailers and others to actually produce food that is lower carbon. And so the onus is on them to do that, and then the consumers kind of see the benefits of that, and you know, and the availability increases and the prices naturally change, etc. I think that's a kind of, that helps address some of those concerns about equity, and so I think that there is a good parallel there that we could apply here.
I mean, I think some of the questions touch on this point that how far do we want to go to change incentives for producers, and to think about farming practices. One of the first questions was, you know, are there big differences in carbon emissions from European agricultural practices, food production, food supply systems versus, say, US, much more industrialized use of chemical fertilizers and so on, or indeed even lower productivity systems of agricultural systems in places like India and so on, where they haven't had the same kind of investment in productivity enhancing measures. So you've just raised the point there, Lorraine, about the sugar tax, of seeking to change the incentives for producers. And when we're thinking about behaviour change, then I suppose these questions are really about what are the ways in which we can incentivize changing farming practices and practices in the food chain, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I have to sort of say I'm definitely not an expert on sort of you know, food systems more broadly, but because my area is really around kind of behaviour change and public engagement. But I would definitely say, I mean, what I didn't present was the results of the from the Climate Assembly, where we were looking at measures to change what farmers are doing, and there was really strong concern that we need to protect farmers' interests and to support them in terms of a transition to net zero, and a concern around this sort of just transition idea, basically, although they didn't sort of talk about it in those terms. But essentially, what do we do about livestock farmers if we are going to be consuming less red meat and dairy? What do we do about people? Are there going to be job losses, and how do we address that? And so that was a really significant concern amongst people at the assembly. They were also concerned about, the role of big supermarkets and how, farmers were not being paid a fair price at the moment by supermarkets, and that we need to kind of think about this. There was also this very strong interest in local food production and getting your food directly from farmers or farmers markets, and so sort of really trying to move away from big supermarkets to much more kind of local food production systems. So it was interesting, actually, that what people really did want to see in terms of a change to food systems, that they weren't happy really with food systems as they currently are, and that farmers' interests were central in what they were sort of considering. So the need to support farmers, train them in new ways of kind of lower carbon agriculture, but also potentially moving away from livestock farming to some extent, at least. That was very much supported in what they were looking at.
One of the questions we have, Lorraine, from our colleague Harry Rutter at the University of Bath, and Harry's basically saying, a lot of what you've presented, Lorraine, shows the sort of gap between public attitudes about what needs to change and what they find acceptable, and what's going to have to change if we're to meet our particularly 2030 targets, if we take seriously the idea that there is a climate emergency requiring more immediate action than is implied by 2050 trajectories. And I suppose that's also a kind of an issue, isn't it, for deliberative assemblies, for citizens' assemblies, that you're effectively there working with citizens, giving them evidence, shaping and helping to inform their deliberations. But if they are still at a very big distance from accepting some of the really radical things that need to change, then the conclusions of some of those assemblies might themselves be deemed inadequate. And I think we've seen that a bit with the Extinction Rebellion, that they've called for local climate assemblies, and then when those climate assemblies have not generated radical conclusions, have tended then to say, well, those actions are insufficient. So how do we address that problem, if you like, of this substantive gap where in some areas we may know there's really radical action required, and yet the public opinion is not anywhere close to it?
So I suppose I would just probably challenge that conclusion. So maybe I didn't sort of present it convincingly enough, but I think actually what came out of the Climate Assembly UK, but also those local climate assemblies, has been broad public support for pretty bold climate change action. And yes, there are sort of differences locally and in terms of some of the methods used and what has come out of it, but actually in the main, there is support for the measures that we need to get to net zero. And where there isn't sort of maybe support for some of those areas, I think it sheds light on how we could make those things more acceptable, more workable. So the contingencies around, we need to think about, this might be acceptable if we thought about what it might mean for disabled groups or people on lower incomes, or how can we make this workable? So there's, even where they weren't sort of strongly supported, there were sort of things that we could say, well, okay, we could feed that into a more effective and acceptable policy design. But I think, I don't see this as being a gap, actually. I mean, if you look at the Climate Change Committee's projections, they say we have to change our diets by at least 20% in the next sort of decade. And what came out of the Climate Assembly UK was support for between 20 and 40% change, reduction in meat and dairy over that time frame. So I think, we're more or less kind of aligned in terms of what has come out of the Assembly, what the climate change advisors are saying, and we're also seeing some of those trends happening even without intervention already. So I think I'm sort of optimistic that we're not actually that misaligned, but we do need to probably still do a bit more work in some areas to ensure that some of those like really controversial measures, like possibly around aviation, for example, but there are one or two other areas where we might need to work harder to actually bring the broader public on board, who are not necessarily those ones that have seen the evidence that was debated at the Assembly.
Yeah. I mean, there's a very interesting point. There's a question that relates to this, which is, if you think there are limits to the approaches that can be taken by sharing information, food labeling, and so on, and limits to shifting norms, that you need more radical approaches. Does your research shift towards understanding policy acceptability and how public leadership can shape the kind of wider climate of public opinion and public acceptability? So I was thinking about the sort of role of politicians and scientists and business leaders and others in, as it were, not just giving information to people, but kind of shifting how policies are viewed and framed and accepted.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a challenge. We're increasingly challenging ourselves within disciplines like psychology to really see the inadequacies of many of the sorts of interventions that we've tended to explore and develop, like information provision. And I think, so it's clear, and now there are recent meta-analyses that really sort of show that actually things like information provision and some of these sort of softer, more psychologically informed interventions by themselves are pretty ineffective to change behaviour. But as part of a broader package of measures, they are quite crucial, actually, because if you don't tell people why we need to change behaviour and why we need to tackle climate change, what are the pros and cons of different things, getting policy acceptability of bolder measures to enable people to actually change their behaviour, those broader contextual interventions, we're not going to be able to implement those things. They would just be kind of opposed. So we do need information as part of it, but we need all those other sort of things like regulations and incentives and stuff too. So that, yeah, I think, and so then I do think it is important that we as researchers are part of discussions about the role that public play and the importance of changing behaviour, so that we are sort of part of that sort of advocacy role is part of what we need to do.
Great. There's some questions that a lot of people are interested in localized food production. You touched on this issue, Lorraine, when you're talking particularly about the Climate Assembly, about public support for local forms of food production, local farmers, local procurement, local food supply, and so on. And obviously there are sort of rational reasons for doing that when you think about sort of carbon miles and air travel and so on. But are there other things at work there which are about attachment to place and attachment to community and the sense of sort of stewardship of your local environment, the countryside around you and so on? I mean, is there something going on there that we might be wanting to, might help us think about these issues?
Oh, absolutely, because I think it was interesting. We presented evidence that was quite clear that food miles actually don't contribute very much to climate change relative to the type of food that you're eating, red meat versus plant-based foods. So, it is, while it's marginally better to eat local versus something that's come from abroad, actually you're better overall by shifting towards a plant-based diet. So we did sort of show that the food miles thing was not a very significant aspect of tackling climate change, but nevertheless that was something that people really did want to see happen anyway. And this I guess speaks to sort of what is acceptable is people were really looking for those additional benefits, and because there were obviously lots of other things that were important to people, so thinking about what's good for the community and health. So what sort of if food is fresh because it's coming from local farmers as well, and I can see I can talk to the person that's produced the food, and it's also fairer because we're not involved in the supermarkets and all these things. So there seemed to be lots of things that were going on when people were talking about local food production. And it's interesting you say about the sort of place attachment, because actually there were lots of topics that were discussed at the Climate Assembly, including transport, for example, surface transport, as well as aviation and other things. And localization was a really strong theme that was supported within the transport topic as well. And that was defined as kind of building neighborhoods in such a way that you didn't need to drive long distances, that you sort of, we don't have so many out of town shopping centers, we shop locally, everything you need is within walking or cycling distance, etc. So people loved that idea within the transport topic as well. And so there does seem to be this kind of idea of sort of localization, which seems to sort of be somehow maybe intuitively appealing for various reasons, and not necessarily because it's the best thing to do to tackle climate change, but because it is, yeah, it brings other sort of social, economic and environmental benefits, I think. Oh, I lost you for a minute.
If you can hear me, I'm sorry, my internet connection is a bit unstable. Yeah, sorry, my internet connection a little bit unstable there. No, I think that's a really interesting point to explore, and whether that's about the human desire for social interaction at a local and neighbourhood level, or whether it's about attachments to place or senses of kind of, you know, history and tradition and so on as well. I mean, it's really very, very interesting. We've got a great question that's just coming towards the end here, which is about, have you done work on people's attitudes to eating the alternatives, i.e. to plant-based products, lentils, beans, vegetable proteins, and the contrast to the most processed alternatives, such as, you know, lab processed meat or veggie burgers, etc. What are the sorts of, is there a sort of, you know, a kind of converse research literature into what sort of things we find attractive or might find more attractive in terms of the non meat and dairy alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of pretty new area, but colleagues are starting to look at this, and so it is interesting that there is, for some people, there's absolutely no problem at all in the idea of kind of lab grown meat, and actually there's an interesting gender divide there. So men seem to be broadly a bit happier with the idea of lab grown meat. Women find it rather unappealing, and I can relate to that. And so, yeah, interesting kind of differences. And then, so there's a lot of variety, actually. And I think so there's sort of, there's broadly speaking, we saw this at this climate assembly, sort of a bit of concern about, well, do we know enough about some of these new technologies to really know that they're safe and healthy, etc. But some people kind of keen, yeah, I'd love to try a sort of, you know, some of these things. And you know, there are new forms of protein being developed or tried out, sort of insect burgers and things. And we did briefly mention those at the assembly. And again, sort of different people have sort of different, you know, yuck factors around some of those things. But yeah, I think we are going to see more and more of those things being developed and on the market. And so I think it remains to be seen to what extent people will be willing to try some of these things, and norms might shift. But yeah, there's some interesting differences, I think, between people in terms of what they find acceptable and not.
We've got some questions which I just want to sort of bring together a bit and probe a little, which is just to return to this question of fairness, and just to understand how much of that is about the sense of procedural fairness, that we're sort of all in it together, that everybody's playing their part, and that we're distributing the kind of responsibilities widely, and nobody's kind of free riding on other people, versus, if you like, the sort of substantive distributional fairness that you know, you're thinking about which you know, particular kinds of, you know, citizens pay more tax, or which you know, if they work in a particular industry, whether they lose their jobs. You were touching on those questions. What's the sort of balance in that sense of fairness between the kind of procedural and the distributional?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this in terms of, again, what came out of the assembly. And I think the focus there was a bit more on the distributional side of things in the main. That was what kind of dominated the discussions. And it was around kind of, you know, lower income groups. It was around people working in certain sectors that might be particularly affected. Maybe people with sort of particular disabilities when it came to kind of travel policies and so on. So there were I'd say the focus was a bit more on the kind of distributional side of policies, but actually, because there was so much emphasis given to kind of information and education, and while that might sort of just be partly because it's an intuitive thing, like it seems like a really, who could disagree with the idea that we have more and better information to inform us. I do think there might be something there around procedural fairness, because these are people who felt actually quite privileged to be able to have access to lots of expert information and be able to kind of discuss and debate these different options. And they felt very strongly that other people should have access to that information and have a say as well in going forward in decision making. So one of the final recommendations that came at the final weekend. There was a set of recommendations that came out, and having more of these sorts of participatory and deliberative approaches was widely endorsed. So I think, having been part of this, there was a sort of growing sense that actually this more kind of participatory fairness, this giving people a bigger say in decision making, was something that they felt should happen more of.
Yeah, so that's obviously something that comes through a lot in the research on deliberative democracy, that people feel very positively about their engagement once they've been through the process of deliberation, been in an assembly. It sort of then has a lasting effect on their engagement as citizens in these sorts of questions. Just one final question, which came in from Barbara Gordon, which this question is, should we all have a kind of individual carbon budget, an individual carbon credit card, if you like, and as it were, then be forced to internalize some of the trade-offs? So if I do really want to fly to see my sister in Australia, then I've just got to, not eat any meat, and I've got to, not drive a car, and so on and so forth. That in some sense, we want to be able both to kind of make the trade-offs ourselves, but also to have a kind of, to be sort of internalizing a cap and trade system, that we've got an overall budget. Is there any research on that, Lorraine?
Yeah, there is, and it's quite interesting. And we touched on it a little bit in the assembly, because I didn't mention this, but the other topic that I led was the sort of what we buy, the consumption topic. And there we presented them with a whole suite of kind of everything from sort of techno fixes, where industry is just being way more efficient, and it's all renewably powered stuff, so we don't need to sort of do too much on the consumer side, through to circular economy, and then more kind of radical things where we were saying, well, income is such a strong driver of carbon footprint, maybe we should actually significantly tax the wealthier, maybe have shorter working weeks so that we will have lower incomes, but more time to do, fix things ourselves, for example, and grow our own food and whatever, and maybe universal basic income. And we touched on the idea of carbon credits as well, as part of, sort of having individual personal carbon quotas as part of that. And some of those more radical things were really just not very well supported. And I think there were concerns that partly it was politically unfeasible to do some of these quite radical sort of economic policies, and that anything like a sort of carbon quota, it smacked of rationing. It felt like actually there'd be a diminishment of quality of life, and that actually, did we really want to go down that route? And that the broader literature on what the public think about carbon quotas and personal carbon trading similarly shows that people are not generally in support of it, because they sort of think of this as a sort of rationing system, even though it does seem like it would address that fairness concern, because you do still have choice, and you actually, everybody's got the same number of credits, and you can trade them. And so actually we all have to make changes to our lifestyle in a very similar way. So you would think it might be more accepted, but for whatever reason at the moment, the way in which people perceive it is that it would not be a good thing. But so I do think that, there might be some work there in which you could communicate it in a way that conveys that fairness more strongly, and increase its acceptability. But at the moment, people's feelings about it are that they're not too keen on it.
So you have this rather complex task of aligning your climate change policies with other social and economic benefits and other endeavours, but being sort of constrained perhaps in going too far with that, to turn it into an agenda which doesn't feel as if it's addressed to the immediate climate challenges, and goes into in more sort of other. I suppose that's a challenge to kind of radical politicians who want to argue that we have to pursue lots of things on lots of different fronts at the same time.
Yeah, but I think that's absolutely the critical, basically, because I think that's it's where politicians can see the economic co-benefits. They're green jobs, and they can see that actually recovering from COVID is aligned with a green transition and tackling climate change, that we can have both. It's about sort of trying to show very clearly that there are these strong co-benefits, that there are multiple reasons for doing this. And so even if you don't care about climate change, and if you don't see it as a risk, actually it could improve your health, actually it could reduce your bills, actually it could create green jobs, or improve our quality of life and well-being, etc. So I think it's absolutely about aligning climate change with those other things, which for the majority of people actually is other things that are more immediate drivers of their behaviour.
Yeah, yeah, and of course we see that very strongly in current political discourse about the benefits of, you know, manufacturing renewables jobs. You know, the whole levelling up agenda is very much premised on that. Indeed, there's a whole sort of way in which climate and the transformation of our economy can bring in these other things that we care about in terms of social justice and economic development. Great. Okay. Well, I think, I mean, I'm trying, as you will see, trying to read some of the questions on the side as I'm speaking, and I think we've covered. There's just a couple of questions about climate assembly. So people, obviously, you said that, you know, people really value their participation in these. One question was, can we include individuals from lower socioeconomic groups? And obviously, my understanding, Lorraine, I think you mentioned this in your talk, is that, I mean, the process of selecting members of climate assemblies is done through random or sortition, or if it's not done by sortition, it is done by means that enable you to say that the group is representative of the population at large. So by socioeconomic group as much as, say, attitudes to climate change. Was that how the Citizens Assembly for Climate was selected?
Yeah, very, very much so. So this idea, yeah, as you say, the sortition, this kind of like the gold standard of ensuring that the participants in that assembly were completely representative of the UK public as a whole, including kind of lower income groups as well as wealthier groups, age, gender, region, attitudes to climate change, and so on. So there was a huge amount of effort. So they sent out tens of thousands of letters to homes, and that was a kind of, I think, a sort of random or quota sample. And then from that, they had X thousands of people say they would be willing to take part, and from that, they ensured that they reached the quotas that would ensure that it was a demographically, regionally, and attitudinally representative sample of the public. Great.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Lorraine. That's a fantastic set of answers to those great questions. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this evening and for putting in your questions. It's been a really great debate, and you know, this is one that will continue throughout the course of this year, particularly in the UK, because as everybody knows, we in Italy are hosting the Conference of the Parties, COP26, later this year in Glasgow. And I just want, before ending this evening's lecture and debate, just to let everybody know about Climate Expo, which is an academic conference that's being held, which my colleagues Amy and Sophie at the IPR have been helping to organise, which is being run by a number of universities with a number of partners. It takes place from the 17th to the 21st of May, and it's basically an organisation of something like 500 speakers, academics, politicians, civil society organisations, activists, over 70 sessions, loads of things to do, loads of great people to tune in and listen to, and all of it helping to build up momentum towards and to feed in towards the journey towards the COP, the Conference of the Parties, later in the year. So please do register for that if you can. All the details are on the IPR website, or just email us at IPR if you want to be involved. And I think my colleague Sophie's just put up a link to that, so for where you can register. And do keep in touch with our own work here at the university as we continue. We're very engaged in these debates on climate change, and we're very lucky to have Lorraine and others at the university who can speak with such authority on their great research into these questions. So Lorraine, thank you very much indeed for talking to us this evening, for taking those questions and answering them so comprehensively. Thank you to everybody for watching and for contributing your questions. And as I say, do come back and join us again in future events. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks very much.